For 6 years, I drove my mother to every chemotherapy appointment. For 6 years, I managed her insurance claims, her prescriptions, her paperwork, her panic attacks at 2 in the morning. For 6 years, I watched my brother post vacation photos from Cancun while I sat in hospital waiting rooms under fluorescent lights, eating vending machine sandwiches, and pretending everything was fine. When the estate attorney finished reading my mother's will, every single asset went to him. The room went completely still. My aunt stopped breathing. My mother's oldest friend looked away. My brother, sitting across the mahogany table in a blazer he definitely bought for this occasion, couldn't quite keep the satisfaction off his face. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small white envelope, and set it on the table between us. That's when his expression changed. My name is Margot Elaine Hathaway, and I was 39 years old when I finally understood that the people who show up don't always get the credit, but sometimes, quietly, they get something better. My mother's name was Barbara. Everyone called her Babs, though she pretended to hate it. She was 67 when the breast cancer came back. Not a new diagnosis, a return. She'd beaten it once in her early 50s, gone into remission, rebuilt her life, learned to garden, joined a book club, started taking pottery classes on Thursday evenings. Then one routine mammogram changed everything again, and the disease came back harder and more determined than before. My brother's name is Fletcher. He's 4 years older than me, and he's spent most of his adult life being extremely good at seeming like a decent person without actually doing much to earn the title. He lives in Phoenix, has for almost a decade, with a wife named Renee and 2 kids I've met maybe 5 or 6 times total. He calls himself an entrepreneur. What that means, practically speaking, is that he floats between real estate ventures and networking events and occasionally borrows money from people who love him. When Mom got the second diagnosis, Fletcher called her. He cried on the phone from what she told me. He said he was devastated. He said he wished he could be there. He said Renee had things going on. The kids had school. The timing was just incredibly difficult. I lived 40 minutes away. I was working as an office manager for a mid-size accounting firm at the time. Good job, not glamorous. Benefits, predictable hours, which mattered. Because predictable hours meant I could rearrange them without the whole structure collapsing. The first year, I told myself it would be manageable. Mom was still mostly independent. She could drive herself some days. She had good weeks and hard weeks, and on the good weeks, she was almost herself again. Making coffee too strong, complaining about the neighbor's landscaping, watching HGTV with the volume too loud. Then year 2 arrived and things shifted. The fatigue from the treatment started accumulating in ways that didn't reverse overnight anymore. She started missing things. A gas burner left on, a bill paid twice, a phone call she swore she'd made that she hadn't. Small things at first, then less small. Her oncologist referred her to a geriatric specialist, and the geriatric specialist introduced words that changed the weight of every conversation. I hired a part-time home health aide for Tuesdays and Thursdays. I paid for it out of my own pocket for the first 4 months because we were still sorting out what Medicare would and wouldn't cover, and I didn't want there to be a gap. I didn't tell Fletcher about that, not because I was keeping score, but because it genuinely didn't occur to me to mention it. You don't announce every accommodation you make for someone you love. You just make them. Fletcher visited twice in 6, once in the second year, for Thanksgiving, which he left early because of a flight he claimed he couldn't change. Once in the 4th year, for a long weekend that coincided with a golf tournament in our area that he'd apparently been planning to attend anyway. He brought my mother flowers both times, which she appreciated, and he sat with her for hours both visits, which I know meant something to her. I'm not saying none of it mattered. I'm saying it wasn't enough, and everyone in that family knew it, even if no one said so out loud. What I remember most from those years isn't the exhaustion, though there was plenty of that. It's the specific texture of certain moments. sitting in the parking garage of the cancer center at 6:45 in the morning, drinking coffee from a gas station cup, waiting for the building to open because mom wanted to be first in line, sleeping on her couch more nights than I can count because she'd had a rough procedure, and I didn't want her to wake up alone at 3 a.m. and feel afraid. Arguing with an insurance representative for 45 minutes about whether a particular anti-nausea medication was considered formulary, and winning, and feeling a kind of hollow triumph that no one else would ever understand. There were things I gave up that I don't talk about much. A relationship that ended partly because I was never fully present, never not carrying something invisible and heavy. A promotion I turned down because the new role required travel, and travel wasn't something I could factor in. A trip to Ireland I'd been saving for since I was 32, sitting in a folder on my laptop, never booked. I'm not listing these things for sympathy. I'm listing them because they were real, and because for a long time I told myself they didn't matter, and eventually I had to stop lying to myself about that. Through all of it, my mother and I rarely talked directly about the will. She was private about money in the way that generation often is. Grew up during a time when you didn't discuss finances, not even with your children. Once, maybe in the 5th year, she mentioned that she'd been working with the attorney to make sure things were organized. She said she wanted both of her kids taken care of. She said it in a way that felt like reassurance, and I took it as one. I assumed the math would be simple. I was the one who had been there, the one who hadn't asked for anything. Surely that would be reflected somewhere. I assumed wrong. 6 years after her second diagnosis, my mother passed away on a Wednesday morning in late October. I was sitting beside her when she went. The room was quiet, and the light outside was doing that particular autumn thing, pale gold through thin clouds, the kind of light that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. The funeral was the following Saturday. Fletcher flew in Thursday night. He gave a beautiful eulogy. He cried at the podium in a way that moved people, and I watched him from the front row and thought, he did love her. That was never the question. The question was something different. 3 weeks after the funeral, we gathered at the office of Whitmore and Associates, the estate attorney my mother had worked with for years. Fletcher brought Renee. I came alone. The attorney, a careful, measured man named Gerald who had clearly delivered difficult news many times before, opened the file and began reading. The house in Dunmore Heights, where my mother had lived for 22 years and where I had spent the better part of 6 years as a constant, went to Fletcher. The investment accounts, a mix of mutual funds and a modest stock portfolio she'd built carefully over decades, went to Fletcher. The savings account, the jewelry, the car, the contents of the house. Fletcher, Fletcher, Fletcher. I sat very still. I felt the room watching me. Renee was staring at the table. Fletcher had gone carefully neutral, the way people do when they're trying not to look like they expected something. Gerald finished reading and set the papers down. No one spoke for a moment that felt much longer than it was. And then I reached into my bag and took out the envelope. It was small, ivory-colored, sealed with a sticker, the kind my mother used for Christmas cards. On the front, in her handwriting, careful and slightly slanted, the way it always was, she had written, "To be opened after the estate reading." I placed it on the table. Fletcher looked at it. Then he looked at me. "What is that?" "She asked me to bring it," I said. "She asked me to give it to Gerald after the reading." Gerald looked at me, then at the envelope, then picked it up. He examined the seal, confirmed it was intact, and carefully opened it with a letter opener from his desks. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, handwritten. He unfolded it and cleared his throat. "If you're reading this, then everything in the will has been read, and my daughter Margot is probably sitting very quietly, the way she does when she's holding something difficult. She's been doing that her whole life. She thinks no one notices." "I notice." The room went completely still. Gerald continued. "Fletcher, I love you. I want you to know that before anything else in this letter. You are my son, and you always will be. But I have to be honest with you now, because I didn't always manage to be honest with you when I was alive, and I don't want to leave this world carrying that. There were years when I made excuses for your absence. I told myself you were busy. I told myself it was complicated. Some of that was true, but not all of it, and I think, somewhere you know that. Renee set her pen down on the table. Margot gave up more than you know. More than I ever told her I knew. She didn't keep score because that's not who she is, but I kept it for her in my own quiet way. Every appointment. Every insurance battle. Every night she slept on my couch because she didn't want me to be alone in the dark. I saw all of it. I want her to know that. I see you, Margot. I have always seen you. I could feel the pressure building behind my eyes. I kept my hands flat on the table. Gerald turned to the second page, and his expression shifted slightly, the careful, professional composure cracking just at the edges. What is written in my estate documents is not the whole picture of what I've left behind. A murmur moved through the room. Fletcher sat forward. 7 years ago, I established a revocable living trust with a separate financial institution. I did this quietly, on the advice of a different attorney, because I wanted to be certain it would be administered correctly and without interference. The trust was funded with a portion of assets that have been growing independently of my estate for the past 7 years. These assets were never commingled with the accounts listed in my will. Gerald paused, reached into the file folder, and withdrew a separate document. Several pages, paper-clipped together. Official. Notarized. The sole beneficiary of this trust is my daughter, Margot Elaine Hathaway. My brother made a sound I had never heard him make before. Not anger. Something closer to recognition. The trust contains the proceeds from the sale of the commercial property on Alderton Road, which I sold privately in 2019. It contains the annuity policy I took out in 2018. It contains the investment account held at Fairfield Capital that I opened in your grandfather's name and restructured after his passing. In total, the trust represents a significantly larger portion of my assets than the estate listed in the will. My aunt made a quiet sound. I could not speak. I know this may seem complicated. I want to explain my thinking. I structured the estate the way I did because I knew Fletcher would need the stability of something immediate. The house, the accounts, the things you can hold in your hands. I structured the trust the way I did because I knew Margot would know what to do with it. She has spent 6 years demonstrating that she understands what it means to be responsible for something fragile and important. That knowledge doesn't disappear. I am trusting her with the harder inheritance, the one that requires patience, stewardship, and the kind of judgment that can't be rushed. Gerald set the letter down and looked at both of us over his glasses. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Fletcher looked at me. Really looked at me, maybe for the first time in years. His eyes were red. He wasn't angry. Or if he was, that wasn't the largest thing on his face. I didn't know, he said finally. I know, I said. I should have been here more. I didn't answer that immediately. Not because I wanted to make him suffer, but because the honest answer was complicated, and that room wasn't the place to work through it. She knew you loved her, I said, and I meant it. He nodded, very slowly. Renee reached over and put her hand on his arm. I could have said more. There was a version of that moment where I laid out every missed phone call, every holiday he'd FaceTimed in for 15 minutes and called it a visit. Every time my mother had defended him to me, and I'd smiled and said nothing. There was a version where I made sure everyone in that room understood exactly what 6 years had cost me. I didn't. Not because I'm a better person than I sometimes think I am, but because I realized, sitting there with that letter in front of me, that it wasn't the point. The point wasn't winning. The point was that my mother had seen me. Really seen me. Had spent 7 years making sure I knew it in the most concrete language available to her. That mattered more than being right in a conference room. Gerald walked me through the trust documents for the next hour. The total value was more than I had let myself imagine. Significantly more. The commercial property on Alderton Road had been worth considerably more than I'd known when she sold it. The annuity had compounded. The investment account had done what well-managed investments do over time. She had been building this quietly while I drove her to appointments and argued with insurance companies and ate gas station sandwiches in parking garages. She had building it because she trusted me to carry it forward. I signed the initial transfer documents that afternoon. The formal trust administration process. A timeline for asset distribution. Some tax considerations we'd work through with a CPA. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't a check handed across a table. It was a process, the kind that requires exactly the kind of patience my mother apparently believed I had. Walking out of that building, I stopped for a moment on the sidewalk. It was a cold afternoon, early November, the sky that particular flat gray that means winter is serious about arriving. I stood there for a minute just breathing. My phone buzzed. Fletcher, texting from somewhere behind me. He and Renee must have taken a different elevator. Can we get dinner sometime? Just the two of us? I think I owe you a real conversation. I looked at that message for a long moment. Here's what I've learned, slowly, over the years since then. Grief and money and family are three separate things that get tangled up together in ways that take a long time to sort out. Fletcher and I have had that dinner. More than one, actually. It hasn't been simple. We've said things that were hard to say, and heard things that were hard to hear, and we're still figuring out what our relationship looks like, now that there's no one in the middle of it, holding it together. But we're figuring it out. That feels like something. The trust assets have been handled carefully. I consulted with a financial advisor, someone my mother's attorney recommended, and we built a plan that I think she would have approved of. Some of it is invested. Some of it paid off debt I'd accumulated during those 6 years. Some of it went toward the Ireland trip, finally booked, finally taken, 11 days last spring. I stood on the cliffs of Moher in the rain and thought about her the entire time, and it was somehow exactly right. I still work. I'm not done. I don't think I'd know how to be done. The habit of usefulness is too deep in me now. But I work differently. With less of that background hum of scarcity and anxiety that I'd carried so long, I'd stopped recognizing it as unusual. The letter is in a frame in my apartment. The second page. The part that says, "I see you, Margot. I have always seen you." Some people, when I tell this story, focus on the money. They want to know the numbers. They want to calculate whether it was worth it, as if that's a calculation that's possible to make. They want to know if I feel vindicated. I think what I feel is something quieter than vindication, more like resolution. The sense of a long sentence finally reaching its period. My mother spent 6 years being cared for, and 7 years caring, in her own way, in her own quiet language of paperwork and planning, and a letter sealed with a Christmas sticker. She was paying attention the whole time. It turns out that's the only thing I ever really needed to know.